Anton is 54, widowed engineer, his own place. He spent 22 years inside a marriage that actually worked. Real partnership, real trust, the kind that takes a decade to build. When it ended, he didn't crack, he grieved, he rebuilt. And when the rebuild was solid, he did what engineers do. He ran the numbers, then he closed the app and never opened it again. And here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. The numbers made sense. More men are opting out of marriage than at any point in modern recorded history. The cultural response is always the same. They're lonely, they're bitter, they're afraid of commitment. Pick whichever explanation makes you feel better. But what if the real explanation is simpler than all of that? What if it's not damage? What if it's math? The question isn't what's wrong with men like Anton. The question is, what did he figure out that most people are too afraid to calculate? He calls it the emotional ledger, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what goes into it. Section 1. Why solitude stopped being the zero. Anton waited for the emptiness. After his wife passed, everyone told him it was coming. The hollow quiet, the deprivation of being alone. He prepared for it the way you prepare for a storm. It never arrived. What came instead surprised him. He woke up in a home that ran at his rhythm, made decisions without negotiating them, moved through his days without scanning the emotional weather of another person. And gradually, something clicked that he didn't have a word for yet. Solitude wasn't zero, it had a positive value. Psychologists Edward Desai and Richard Ryan built 4 decades of research on what actually produces human well-being. Their self-determination theory identifies 3 core needs: autonomy, competence, and genuine relatedness, not romantic partnership, not marital status. Those 3 things. And here's what Anton discovered in practice. Solitude, done intentionally, satisfies all 3. He directed his own time. He stayed sharp at work. He maintained real friendships, not performed ones. The theory matched what he was living. So the old framing collapsed. Being alone stopped being the problem to solve and started being the baseline to protect. This is where the bad math framework actually begins. Because math requires a baseline. You can't calculate a return without knowing what you already have. And what Anton had was something measurable: peace, autonomy, self-directed energy. A life that cost him nothing to maintain. So ask yourself this: if that's what solitude actually delivers, what does a new relationship need to offer to make the trade rational? Not emotionally appealing, rational. The bar isn't better than nothing. The bar is better than this. Most men never set that bar consciously. Anton set it by accident, and once he did, he couldn't unsee what it revealed about the cost side of the ledger. That cost side has 6 specific inputs. They don't look like wounds, they look like overhead, and they compound. Section 2. The 6 inputs. Anton stopped funding. Anton noticed the first one on a 3rd date. Nothing was wrong. She was interesting. The conversation moved easily, but somewhere around the 90-minute mark, he caught his mind running a process he hadn't authorized. Monitoring her tone shifts, reading her silences, watching for mood changes, not consciously, just running, the way an app drains a battery even when you're not using it. He recognized it immediately. He'd felt it before, in the early years of his marriage, before trust made it unnecessary. He called it vigilance fatigue, and it was already costing him before anything meaningful had even started. The emotional cost of dating doesn't show up as one big bill. It accumulates, quietly, across hundreds of small transactions that never appear on any single day's balance sheet. Anton identified 6 of them. He calls them inputs, not because he's cold about it, but because naming them precisely is the only way to see them clearly. Input 1. Vigilance fatigue. When a relationship doesn't feel fully safe, not dangerous, just uncertain, the nervous system runs a background process. It's monitoring, scanning, anticipating. You're not consciously doing it. It just runs. and it costs cognitive energy around the clock. Input 2. The self-censorship tax. This is the gradual process of editing yourself down to a version that keeps the peace. You soften the opinion, you adjust the joke. You don't say the thing that might land wrong. Each edit is small enough to rationalize. Over months, you look up and the person in the relationship isn't quite you anymore. It's a smaller, more careful version of you. Anton recognized this one fast. His marriage never asked for it. His wife knew the unedited version and stayed anyway. The contrast was immediate. Input 3. Emotional labor asymmetry. Something goes wrong in her day, and you hold that. Something goes wrong in your day, and you also hold that, because the bandwidth isn't there for both at once. The load flows in one direction. It doesn't make anyone a villain, but it's real work. And over time, it produces a specific kind of exhaustion that's hard to trace back to its source. Input 4. Rejection fatigue. Not one big wound, hundreds of small ones, a conversation that goes cold without explanation, an effort that gets no acknowledgement, a moment of genuine openness that receives a distracted response. The nervous system logs everyone, and the nervous system keeps a running total. Input 5. Recovery time debt. Every relationship cycle that ends requires a rebuild, emotionally, cognitively, in terms of basic trust. That rebuild takes months, sometimes longer. At 34, painful but workable. At 54, Anton did the math differently. The number of cycles he could reasonably absorb was finite. Spending a year recovering from a relationship that never should have started looked like a cost he couldn't keep paying. Input 6. The reciprocity deficit. Investment flowing outward. Time, vulnerability, emotional presence, consistency without genuine return. Not because return was promised and withheld, but because effort produced continued possibility of return, not return itself. That distinction matters. It's the slot machine mechanism. The next pull might pay out, so you keep pulling. The investment never stops. The actual reciprocity never arrives. These aren't grievances. They're variables. Anton laid all 6 out the way an engineer lays out system inputs, then asked the only question that mattered. What would the return side of this ledger need to look like to make that cost rational? He already knew the answer. He'd lived it. And that changes everything about how you read what comes next. Section 3. The secure attachment standard, what Anton already knows. Here's the twist that most people miss when they try to explain men like Anton. He isn't guessing what a good relationship feels like. He isn't working from a theory or a checklist. He isn't optimistic about something he's never had. He's holding a reference point, a lived, embodied, bone-deep understanding of what secure attachment feels like from the inside. That changes everything. Secure attachment, defined behaviorally rather than theoretically, looks like 6 specific things: consistent presence without scorekeeping, conflict that resolves cleanly, not silence used as punishment, not issues buried and resurfacing later with interest. Reciprocal vulnerability. Both people take real emotional risks, not just one performing openness while the other evaluates. A baseline calm. The relationship lowers your cortisol rather than raising it. Investment that returns. Effort produces genuine reciprocity, not just the possibility of it. An autonomous support. Each person's independence gets celebrated, not quietly resented. Anton experienced the 1st, the 4th, and the 5th for over 2 decades. He knows what a relationship that lowers your baseline tension feels like to live inside. He knows what it's like when your effort actually comes back. So when he encounters modern dating, he isn't comparing what he finds to an ideal he constructed in his head. He's comparing it to something he can recall with specificity. And what modern dating tends to produce instead: intermittent contact, hot and cold cycles, vulnerability performed for evaluation rather than shared genuinely, ambient tension, effort without return. None of it clears the bar. Not because the bar is unreasonable, because he's already stood on the other side of it. The Harvard study of adult development tracked people across 80-plus years and arrived at one finding that cuts through every cultural narrative. It's relationship quality, not relationship status, that determines well-being. Not whether you're partnered, how the partnership actually functions. A low-quality relationship is measurably worse for mental and physical health than being alone. These aren't abstract numbers. These are outcomes men like Anton have watched play out in friends' second marriages, in their own rebuilt lives, in the difference between how they feel on a calm Sunday alone versus the ambient tension of a relationship that never quite stabilized. Anton wasn't choosing solitude over partnership. He was choosing a known positive over a probable negative. From the outside, his standards look impossibly high. From the inside, they're just honest. Now you have both sides of the ledger. The cost side is real and specific. The standard for return is clear and grounded. The next question is what actually happens when Anton runs the numbers. Section 4, Running the Bad Math, Anton's Calculation. When Anton meets someone new, something specific happens in his mind. It isn't cynicism activating. It isn't a wall going up. It's closer to what happens when he sits down with a new engineering project. He starts reading the system. Inputs, outputs, how the components behave under pressure, whether the structure holds when conditions change. He watches for the secure attachment behaviors, not as a conscious checklist, but as signals his reference point recognizes on contact. The question isn't, do I like this person? Liking people isn't the variable. The question is whether what's happening between them maps to what he knows a functioning system looks like, or whether it maps to something else dressed up to resemble it. Because that distinction is harder to read than most people expect. Someone can mirror vulnerability without actually being vulnerable. Someone can show consistent presence in the early weeks when novelty is doing the heavy lifting, then shift when novelty fades. The performance and the real thing look almost identical at first. Anton's reference point is what lets him tell them apart. What he's calculating underneath all of it is what he calls the chaos tax. It isn't a list of red flags, it's a running total of what each interaction costs him to process. Ambient tension costs something. Walking on eggshells costs something. A conversation that ends without resolution costs something. An explanation he has to carefully pre-edit before delivering costs something. None of these are catastrophic on their own, but Anton adds them up because he knows they don't stay small, they compound. So the math runs continuously, not as a verdict, as a read. And at some point in every new connection he's tried since his wife passed, the read has come back the same way. The secure attachment behaviors he's watching for, the baseline calm, the consistent presence, the investment that returns, are either absent or inconsistent. The chaos tax keeps accumulating. The cost side fills up. The return side stays thin. The moment the math fails isn't dramatic. There's no confrontation, no decision made in anger. It's more like a door closing quietly after a long look. From the outside, that looks like retreat. From the inside, it looks like clarity. And here's what most people miss when they see a man like Anton and assume something is broken. Choosing a life that doesn't drain you isn't damage. It isn't bitterness. It isn't fear. It's a rational response to negative ROI. But this raises the final question, and it's the one that actually matters for anyone watching this. Section 5. The 7-day emotional ledger. Most people who encounter the bad math framework understand it immediately and then don't know what to do with it. The concept lands. The application doesn't follow automatically. That gap is the problem. So here's where Anton's thinking becomes something you can actually use, not as a theory, not as a lens, as a tool. For 7 days, track 2 columns, notes, app, journal, piece of paper. The format is irrelevant. What matters is that you're honest about both sides, because the ledger only works if you don't cheat the numbers. Column A is what you invested. Emotional labor, The quiet, invisible kind that never makes it into a conversation but costs you something anyway. Vulnerability you extended without knowing if it would be received. Times you edited yourself down before speaking because the unedited version felt like a risk. Patience held, presence given. Moments you absorbed someone else's emotional state and managed your own simultaneously, in silence, without acknowledgement. Log them without judgment. You're not building a case against anyone. You're reading a system. There's a difference. Column B is what came back. Genuine reciprocity, not the possibility of it, the actual thing. Moments you felt seen without performing for it. Connection that didn't ask you to be smaller. Interactions that left peace behind rather than taking it with them. Growth that moved in both directions, not just outward from you. At the end of 7 days, read the net balance, not yet an interpretation, not a verdict, not a decision about what the other person deserves or what you should do next, just the data. The way Anton reads a system before he touches anything. What is actually here? What is actually happening? What the numbers say when you stop telling them what you want them to say. Because here's what Anton knows, and what most people sense long before they admit it. The balance isn't usually a surprise. Most people already know what the ledger says before they write a single line. The exercise doesn't produce new information. It makes existing information legible. It converts what you've been carrying silently into something you can actually see. And seeing it clearly is different from sensing it vaguely, even when the content is identical. The ledger isn't a weapon. It isn't a wound. It doesn't tell you to leave. It doesn't tell you to stay. It tells you what's true. And the only thing it asks in return is that you read it honestly. Anton didn't stop doing the math because the math got easier. He stopped accepting a ledger that never balanced. That's not the same thing. Not even close. From the outside, that looks like resignation. From the inside, it looks like finally reading what was already written. Conclusion: choosing solitude isn't giving up on love. It's refusing to fund a system that can't return what love actually requires. That's the calculation Anton made. Not in bitterness, not in damage, in clarity after running the numbers long enough to trust what they kept saying. And if you're watching this, there's a reasonable chance you're running the same calculation, even if you haven't had the language for it until now. So this week, open the ledger, run it for 7 days. Don't interpret it, don't decide anything. Just read what the balance actually says. That's the first step. The rest follows. If the bad math framework clarified something, the next video goes deeper. Why secure attachment is harder to find than it's ever been, and exactly what it looks like when it's real.